So welcome back, everybody. It's just ticked past 11 a.m. PST. Delighted to have so many of you still with us for Looking Like a Person, Portraits After Coloniality. Our second session is on humans and other depictions in 18th century art, and it will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Melinda McCurdy. Melinda, over to you.
All right, thanks, Steve. I'm so happy to be moderating this session. I am a historian of the art of the long 18th century, so I'm really excited to have our three speakers today. Our next speaker is Amy Freund. Amy is an associate professor and the Klein-Heitz Family Endowed Chair in Art History at Southern Methodist University. Her first book, Portraiture and Politics in Revolutionary France, which is published in 2014, examines the use of portraiture to reformulate personal and political identity during the French Revolution. She is currently completing her second book, Noble Beasts, Hunters and Hunted in 18th Century French Art, which argues for the centrality of hunting art to late 17th and 18th century French art and explores its impact on Enlightenment notions of the human self and political authority. Amy.
I of course started by joining everybody and thanking Malik, Melinda, and all the organizers of today's conference for this opportunity on the occasion of the conservation of Blue Boy and the reveal of the new Kehinde Wiley portrait to reconsider how portraiture works and for whom. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas constructed a system of ethics around other people's faces. For Levinas, moral consideration must be given to others by virtue of their faces, faces that are like ours and that address us directly. Gainsborough's Blue Boy, with its unusual full-face pose, seems like particularly good evidence for Levinas's argument about human selfhood. But when asked by an interviewer if he believed that animals had faces, Levinas hedged. First he said, "One cannot entirely refuse the face of an animal." Then he admits, "I cannot say at what moment you have a right to be called face." Finally, Levinas reasserts the primacy of the human. Levinas's waffling about the animal face reflects his hesitancy about whether humans can or should credit animals with an independent and individualized subjectivity. The question of the animal face long predates Levinas's ethics, of course. Indeed, the problem of the animal self is surprisingly central to 18th century portraiture and to Enlightenment debates about the human self. Gainsborough's own body of work is a case in point. To that end, I thought it would be a worthwhile exercise to think about human portraiture in juxtaposition with dog portraiture. My talk today is drawn from my own research on 18th century France, but my argument, I think, can be extended to 18th century Britain, which was one of the most dog-friendly visual cultures in the history of art. To introduce us to the dog portraiture problem in a French context, I'll start with another Blue Boy, which explicitly confronts its viewers with the problem of the animal face. Louis Tocqué's portrait of the future Duke of Orleans includes a hunting dog and two swans, details that energize an otherwise formulaic presentation of a young nobleman. And I swear that Zirwat and I have not yet spoken about Signes, swans and signs and Locke, but I'm very pleased to have inadvertently made the connection. The dog and swans could be read as symbols of childhood, of educability, of appetite satisfied and suppressed, or of a refined and lordly mastery over lesser beings. But they could also be read as portraits of a dog and two swans. What in fact prevents us from calling the Tocqué painting a group portrait? We consider the figure of the boy to be a portrait because his face seems individualized rather than idealized, because the composition and the pose accord with what we understand to be 18th century portrait conventions, and because we have textual evidence attesting to the purpose of the painting. It's worth noting, however, that this kid neither instigated nor paid for the portrait, something he certainly has in common with the dog and the swans. In the case of the swans, it's tempting to repeat Levinas's hedging. Does a swan have a face to be painted? Most 21st century viewers, and probably their 18th century counterparts as well, would hesitate to accord the swans the same consideration and rights to representation as the boy. But things get fuzzier, literally and metaphorically, when it comes to the dog. Dogs then and now occupy a special place in human hearts and thought, and were firmly established as companion animals in households at all levels of society in the 18th century. It's not surprising then that dog portraiture, independent likenesses of individual dogs, become an important mode of visual representation in 18th century France. In works like this one, the dog's body bears the weight of signification. But what in fact is signified by the dog portrait? Today, I want to think about what dog portraits can tell us about the central problem of this conference, what it means to look like a person. Dog portraiture, I'll argued, asserted that the commensurability of human and canine subjectivity, and also embroiled itself in debates about portraiture and human hierarchies in the age of colonialism. Francois Desportes, the author of the painting we're looking at here, popularized the dog portrait in France at the end of the 17th century. But how do we even know this is a dog portrait rather than a painting of dogs? The specificities and the imperfections of the dog's coats, as well as the centering of the composition on their faces, suggest that Desportes intended to represent the dogs and perhaps also the parrot as individuals, while the secondary compositional role of the hares and their position as victims, plus the fact that hares were not usually kept as pets, suggests that they are accessories rather than subjects of the portrait. Truth be told, scholars of human portraiture don't often have much more secure evidence than we have here. We rely instead on our knowledge of the genre's conventions and our judgment of what constitutes particular human features to distinguish between a portrait and a figure study or genre painting. Thinking about dog portraiture requires human artists and viewers then and now to recognize non-human faces, as Levinas would have put it, and non-anthropocentric portrait conventions, skills that already suggest serious human consideration of non-human animals. The questions raised by dog portraiture are not just a dog problem, they're a portraiture problem. The elevation of dogs to the dignity of portraiture tests the genre's powers to legitimate its sitters as independent studies worthy of regard in all senses of the word. We can see Desportes, who was trained as a human portraitist, working through these problems in this painting, Bun, Nun, and Pun, a likeness of 3 of Louis XIV's gun dogs. The canvas is monumental in scale. As a comparison, it's only slightly smaller than Hyacinthe Rigaud's famous 1701 portrait of Louis XIV, the dog's master. The 3 dogs, all bitches, are stalking a trio of partridges concealed in the brush at far right. Each dog is posed differently. Pun points to the birds, Bun creeps forward toward them, and Nun crouches and turns her head, paw lifting and tongue protruding. Their heads form a triangle that emphasizes both their common focus and their individual physiognomies and expressions. The inclusion of the dogs' names in gold letters further distinguishes them from each other. It's not precisely a human subjectivity that Desportes attributes to Bun, Pun, and Nun, but rather a distinct animal self. The triangle of heads that draws attention to the dog's physiognomies also emphasizes the exercise of their superior senses, their pointed noses, their luxuriant ears, their fixed gazes, and even Nun's tongue. The Desportes' formal choices invite us to consider the dogs as denizens of a non-human world, attuned to the sounds, sights, smells, and tastes of nature, but also as independent named subjects worthy of human contemplation. Moreover, Desportes' portrait encouraged meditation on human-animal partnership. The dogs are marked by human intervention. Their trimmed tails are bodily traces of the human hand, but their poses also testify to their careful training. Gun dogs learn from puppyhood to point, flush, and retrieve birds, a regimen which requires considerable skill on the part of the human trainer and intelligence on the part of the dog. To a human hunter's eye, Bun, Nun, and Pun are restraining their instincts and channeling their superior senses to assist in a human endeavor. Desportes' portrait does not argue that dogs and humans are exactly the same, but it is a very large and expensive recognition of the value of the canine self. The idea of an animal self was in fact promoted by many Enlightenment thinkers, all of whom rely on dogs as their best example. Sarah Cohen's recent book, Enlightened Animals in 18th Century Art, provides a magisterial account of French Enlightenment thinking about animals, All I'll do here is highlight a few choice quotes about dogs. The famous encyclopedia, for instance, is effusive about dogs. So many and such good qualities have, so to speak, rendered dogs worthy of the company of men. They live on the leftovers from our table, they share our lodgings with us, they accompany us when we go out. In some, they know how to please us to the point that there are many people who carry them with them and make them sleep in the same bed. Voltaire himself emphasized the similarities between humans and dogs, asking his imaginary interlocutor in a 1764 essay, "Don't you resemble your dog in thousands of ways?" Even philosophers who argued that animal souls were inferior to human ones still gave dogs some credit, as in the case of Boulier's 1728 philosophical essay on the soul of animals. Boulier tellingly uses portraiture as a metaphor. When speculating on the limits of the animal self, he argues, it would only have some characteristics of the human soul. It would be its reduced portrait. The striking thing about this argument is that it was very common in the 18th century to produce reduced versions of portraits, in engravings like this one and in other media. The reduction of the king's portrait is still a portrait of the king. If the animal self is the reduction of the human self, it's still a self. As Boulier's metaphor suggests, portraiture is a particularly powerful tool for the articulation of value and status, and Desport's painting tapped into that cultural power. The most striking example of the valorization of dog portraiture is not textual, but visual, an illustrated 1784 inventory of royal paintings. Desport's dog portraits are an illustrious company here. Nun, Bun, and Pun is hung there in the center just below Leonardo's portrait of an unknown woman known as La Belle Ferronnière and a Holbein portrait of an unknown man. These dogs' names, likenesses, and cultural capital long outlived them and their royal master, which means that Desport's paintings fulfilled the basic requirements of portraiture more successfully than Leonardo's or Holbein's. Desport would go on to paint many more portraits of dogs for elite clients. In the 1720s, he was joined in the high-end dog portrait market by Jean-Baptiste Udry. For instance, Udry provided this series of royal dog and cat and duck portraits for Louis XV. As you can see from this slide, he carried on the dog portraiture conventions developed by Desport, his older rival. For instance, Udry's dog portraiture for the king was supplemented by a brisk private portraiture business. In these commissions, Udry seems to have felt freer to deploy his own particular talents, which include a healthy sense of humor. This portrait immortalizes two lapdogs in pursuit of two canaries, which themselves are domesticated animals. Neither of the dogs, frankly, has any chance of catching those birds. The one on the left isn't even trying. Instead, he or she stares out of the composition in a witty commentary on the conventions of eye contact in portraiture and the difficulties of bringing any sitter to heel. Udry's games with scale and with the markers of human artifice are equally clever. The inclusion of the column, for instance, recalls grand manner portraiture on both sides of the channel, here embodied by another Gainsborough portrait in the Huntington's collection. And I think the portrait's even funnier when juxtaposed with the discipline and dignity of the king's dogs. In short, Udry is secure enough in the legitimacy of dog portraiture to play with its conventions, and self-aware enough to joke about the relationship between human and dog portraiture. I've made an argument here for an 18th century culture of portraiture that could, to return to the theme of our conference, make a dog look like a person. But there's a more disturbing argument to be made about 18th century portraiture and the gradations of personhood, which is one that we've already been articulating so far in the conference. Udry's dogs with their prominent collars inevitably recall the representation of enslaved people, who in the early 18th century appeared with some frequency in portraits of elite white sitters. Such is the case in a 1696 portrait by Largelière of an elite woman with an enslaved boy wearing a metal collar. The visual analogy between dog and enslaved human is made all the more disturbing by the fact that the boy is holding a lapdog. The lapdog itself is collarless and making direct eye contact with the viewer, suggesting that dogs were credited with a more autonomous subjectivity than people of color in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. This too then is an example of the power of portraiture to define who looked like a person. The heyday of dog portraiture in France coincided, of course, with the expansion of France's 18th century colonial empire. France's most profitable colony in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, depended on a brutal sugar plantation economy fueled by a constantly renewed supply of slave labor from Africa. There's no doubt that animal painting served the interest of France's white elites, most obviously by disguising colonialism in the clothes of natural science and a culture of wonder. That was already made obvious in Desport's very early dog portrait that we've already seen, with the inclusion of the African parrot, most likely imported as a pet. And in fact, Desport was intimately involved in one of the most explicit French representations of slavery in the colonial economy, reworking a set of 17th century tapestry cartoons depicting Dutch Brazil into an 18th century French celebration of the bounties of the Americas. The series mixed European, African, and American animals with representations of enslaved Africans, here in the scene known as the Two Bulls, against the backdrop of sugar mill. And Udry is best known today, largely thanks to the Getty exhibition and the restoration of this painting, for his series of portraits of non-European animals in the Royal Menagerie, or in the famous case of Clara the rhinoceros, of exotic animals toured around Europe as curiosities. Finally, it's worth noting that autonomous portraits of Black people remained very rare in 18th century France, while animal portraiture of all kinds was increasingly common. Thanks to the work of Anne Lafont, Darcy Grigsby, Helen Weston, James Smalls, and Denise Murrell, among others, these paintings have changed the way we understand portraiture in the 18th century, but they remain a vanishingly small percentage of the portraits produced in the period. I think I've mixed up my slides. Here we go. When your principal dog portraitists and their human clientele are invested in the elevation of animal bodies at the expense of Black bodies, we need to think carefully about who benefits and who suffers when we think of dogs as persons. Pierre Cernat, writing about the growing recognition of animal rights at the end of the 18th century in France, has argued that a society that accepts that animals as only different from humans in degree, but is still willing to use and eat them, is embracing a sliding scale of personhood. That sliding scale, Cernat points out, also naturalizes human differences of class and race. In other words, if dogs are a kind of person, but are nonetheless controlled by white elites, it's easier to justify controlling poor and non-white people. Portraiture, then and now, conferred status and agency on its sitters, or as Levinas might say, granted its sitters a face. The proliferation of dog portraiture expanded the category of person in the 18th century. But that proliferation, compared to the paucity of portraits of non-white people, also made clear who didn't have access to portraiture and who wasn't considered a person. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was great. Our final speaker for this panel is Amelia Rouser. She is the Associate Dean of the Faculty and Professor of Art History at Franklin and Marshall College. Her recent work focuses on the global textile trade in the 18th century and the relationship between textiles, fashionable practices, and identity. Her book, The Age of Undress, came out in 2020. Amelia.
How can a textile make a person? In the 1790s, two textiles, muslin and madras, carried deep significance not only for identity, but even for conceptions of liberty and subjectivity that were at the heart of both Enlightenment discourse and political contestation. If we look at this miniature, 1795 miniature by Jean-Antoine Laurent, we see it depicts a blonde white woman in a garden wearing a simple neoclassical dress with a drawstring neckline and short sleeves. With a straw hat slung over her elbow, she presents herself as natural, authentic, and at ease. But this portrait represents her as not just a fashionable woman, but as a fashionable white woman. I want to argue that her racialized whiteness is specifically articulated here via the deployment of textiles, and that these had particular meanings and roles in colonialist exchange: the white cotton muslin of her dress and the plaid cotton madras of her sash and shawl. These elements of her ensemble, which were typical of the high-waisted sheer style of the 1790s and 1800s known as neoclassical dress, were deeply bound up with race, as those who wore them negotiated conceptions of freedom, nature, subjectivity, primitivism, and transparency. Although neoclassicism was the house style of revolution in France and associated with enlightened and liberal values elsewhere, neoclassical dress's associations with the material culture of enslavement were simultaneously openly cultivated. Neither contemporaries nor later scholars have much remarked this connection. Instead, the links to classical art and universalist conceptions of liberty and truth were more commonly discussed, especially by contemporaries. However, when we look closely, we can see that neoclassical fashion reveals it's undeniably incorporating gestures to the plantation culture and enslaved people of the West Indies. First, of course, the fiber itself was marked through and through with the material conditions of its making by Black and enslaved hands. Cotton was secondary to sugar as the major crop of the Caribbean plantation system, but it was nonetheless responsible for tens of thousands of slaves being imported to the Caribbean during the period. And this was the key fiber for neoclassical dress, used both in muslin and in madras. And this was a departure from the dominant textiles of earlier eras, which were mostly made of linen, silk, or wool, fibers that were cultivated in Europe and had significant connections to different European identities. By contrast, cotton was a modern and imperial textile and fiber, the product of global networks and industrial innovation. Thus, the white muslin, the same white muslin that glossed some bodies as natural and classical, whole and unfragmented, caused other bodies to be enslaved and endangered. The woman in this portrait wears a round gown, a dress that slips over the head rather than being joined in the front. And this form was itself a West Indian invention, well documented, for example, in paintings by Agostinho Brunius of Caribbean life. And the whiteness of the dress was accentuated by adopting the West Indian practice of bluing, which meant washing with indigo. Here, an artist portrays laundresses in Saint-Domingue wearing and washing white muslin and plaid madras cloth. Indeed, the distinctive brilliance of white cotton, blued and bleached in the Caribbean, caught the eye of Marie Antoinette in 1782 and helped inaugurate the fashion for this textile in France. The miniature portrait also includes two types of madras. A red and green check is used to sash the sitter's waist, while a blue shawl with a striped border forms the backdrop. This cloth is still a part of traditional dress in the West Indies, and it was known in the 18th century as basically a slave currency. It was woven in South India expressly for the export market. From there, it was imported to England, where it was banned from wide sale by laws that were designed to protect the domestic textile industry. And it was instead auctioned off to slave traders in the UK, who then used it to barter for slaves in West Africa and to clothe slaves in the Caribbean. The Caribbean was one of the few markets within the British and French empires where it could be legally sold. Through this trade, many people in West Africa came to prize the plaid, Indian-made cloth that was traded by Europeans and developed their own artistic dress practices involving cutting threads from the cloths and creating new designs. So textiles became known as injiri among the Kalabari people of the Niger Delta, while the Igbo people of northern Nigeria called it George, perhaps named after Fort St. George, which anchored the East India Company trading post in Madras, which is today Chennai. Several of these Creole neoclassicism fashion elements can be observed in this 1786 portrait. This is known today as Portrait of a Haitian Woman. It was painted in Saint-Domingue in 1786 by a Canadian-born white artist who was in the Caribbean during these years and probably was the owner of this enslaved woman. And then the painting ended up in Canada later on. So there's some sense in which the painting may have traveled with the family, as the enslaved person most likely did as well. Here she's clad in a loose white round gown made of white cotton, wearing a madras plaid handkerchief as a head wrap and prominent gold hoop earrings. Gold hoops, by the way, had been connected with Black bodies and New World marine discovery for a very long time. And by the 18th century, they were associated with Creole culture, both enslaved and free, and were also taken up by white women as fashionable accessories during the 1790s. Here, Madame Tallien wears them with her blonde wig in 1796. The sitter here may have been named Marie-Thérèse Zemire, and as I said, she was likely an enslaved servant of the family of the artist. The head wrap she wears was another distinctively West Indian garment that became absorbed into European neoclassical fashion. First mandated by sumptuary laws as a way to mark the free colored woman, the head wrap was appropriated by women of all colors and classes in the West Indies and worn in a variety of forms and folds, both in madras plaid and plain muslin. In this portrait of Catholic charity worker Juliette Toussaint, we can see her wearing a madras head wrap with coral jewelry. She was born enslaved in Saint-Domingue, but her freedom was purchased by her husband, who remained enslaved to his own French owners, but nonetheless earned a fortune as a hairdresser in New York City during the 1790s and purchased his wife's freedom. Turbans and head wraps like these were, as I said, also widely adopted by fashionable European women in the 1790s, and in fact became the signature accessory of the directoire hostess Juliette Recamier, and was depicted in most representations of her, including this famous bust by Chenard. White women also wore madras as head wraps. You can see that here in an English miniature portrait on the left and a French fashion illustration on the right. So these two portraits then, they drape their sitters in somewhat similar garments and textiles. But what's the effect on our understanding of their subjectivity as we look at these two portraits? To use the terms of this conference, are they both people? I would say it's complicated. Some scholars have noted that the bare breast of the Black woman in the painting at the right is a sign of her objectification. They argue that the painting is erotically charged, indicating the sitter's precarious and vulnerable body and her vulnerability to sexual exploitation by her owner, who is also the artist/viewer of this portrait. One commentator says flatly, upper-class white female sitters simply would not have been represented in this fashion. But that's not true. In fact, the bare breast was a feature of many white women's portraits in the 1790s. This was actually common and fashionable in female portraits in the directory in a very particular way, but it was especially used by artists and women artists for self-representation, as you can see in the example on the left. Here, Marie-Geneviève Bouliard depicts herself as Aspasia, the lover of Pericles. So that's somewhat of an allegorical setting, but the painting on the right shows a young woman with her dog, speaking of dog portraits, and both these women have their right breast exposed. I've already shown you a couple other examples of portraits where women are showing their breast exposed, as in this one I showed you a moment ago. So the exposure of the breast itself was not a straightforward signal of a kind of depersonalizing allegory or dehumanizing eroticization or objectification, as it had been before and would be later. It seems instead to have been a very contemporary signal of fashionability because it was connected to the way in which women were thinking of themselves as artworks come to life. And there was a sort of significance to the exposure of the body in this period that was somewhat particular. So these sartorial gestures, the muslin round gown, the hoop earrings, the madras cloth, the head wrap, they add up to a deliberate reference to the visual and material culture of the West Indies when imported into the context of European fashion. And this cultural appropriation is in many ways a familiar story. A mainstream culture or a dominant culture borrows symbols from a marginalized culture to enjoy the edgy cool of its significations without the consequences of its lived reality. The next question, of course, is why? Why do this? What exactly did Creole culture or Caribbean culture or enslaved culture signify to Europeans in the 1790s? And what did it mean to sediment these associations on top of other significations of neoclassical dress? And I'm not actually going to pursue the answer to that question in this talk, but that is the next obvious question. I want to instead return to the concept of personhood. Is this Haitian woman, in a deep sense, portrayed as a person? How far did the boundaries of citizenship, subjectivity, and bodily autonomy extend? And of course, this was very much not a theoretical exercise in the period that we're talking about here. This is a moment of dramatic renegotiation of the terms of subjectivity and citizenship and identity in the 1790s and in Saint-Domingue in particular. The Haitian Revolution was calling for accountability to these expressed values in the 1790s, and the renegotiation was happening in the French mainland as well. This print, Moi Libre Aussi, produced to mark the abolition of slavery in French territories in 1794, is responding to the revolutionary call for equality by imaging a Black woman as a free citizen. Here, the woman is ornamented with a plumb bob and a quadrant, revolutionary symbols for equality, and she wears a draped white head wrap and a simple neoclassical gown. Is this the garb of an allegory of liberty, a generally classicized metaphor? Or does this portray a real, specific West Indian woman who's pointedly asserting her freedom? The collision between nature, fashion, classicism is allowing this print to hover between allegory and political assertion. And the triple significations of neoclassical dress as European fashion, classical costume, and West Indian sartorial practice are doubling back on one another here, bolstering, I would say, a bid for this image as a sincere representation of an idealized picture of liberty and equality. And yet, it is also very easy to find other portraits that pointedly reject any extension of subjectivity and natural virtue to Black people via the language of neoclassical dress. Or maybe I shouldn't say other portraits, but other images. So forgive this offensive image, but it's relevant to the discussion. This colored stipple engraving was published in Paris in 1803 and is arguing that the natural beauty of neoclassical dress really only made sense on the body of a white woman. Here, a white woman has dressed up her servant or slave in fashionable neoclassical dress and jewelry and holds the woman's face before the mirror. The contrived contrast here is between Black and white, the fashionably gussied up and the nonchalantly attired, the ugly, because the servant is missing a tooth, and the beautiful. Look, what a beautiful little face, the title tells us ironically, and the viewer is meant to smile because despite the effort she has made, the beautiful face, of course, the viewer is meant to think the beautiful face really belongs to the white woman looking back at us, not the sort of ludicrously clad Black woman who is meant to be portrayed here, I think meant to be perceived by the viewer as strange and unnatural in her cameos and white muslin. So the unnatural quality of this costume on this Black body, I think is meant to argue that freedom itself doesn't belong to this body, nor does personhood. So the white woman who wore neoclassical dress in the 1790s were attempting to yoke together diverse discourses. On the one hand, they're fashioning themselves as statues, as artworks come to life, in order to claim the inheritance of classicism and to embody a truly aesthetic life in which they had creative agency and subjective freedom. Yet by layering over these ideas the elements of the dress of enslaved people and the culture in which they lived, women were also insisting on their own whiteness and freedom by contrast with the abjection of slavery. By accessorizing with a textile that was used in a dehumanizing economy, madras cloth, they were accentuating by contrast their own personhood. And yet, even as we recognize this set of meanings for neoclassical dress and we expose it, it's equally important to note the ways in which Black women and men from the 18th century through today have reappropriated madras cloth, recontextualizing it from the slave textile that it began with to an instrument of collective identity and as an embodied practice, both in West Africa and the West Indies today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think to kick us off for some questions and conversation, I just would like to really quickly share my screen because these are the two paintings that are really bookending our conversations today. On the left is a brand new painting by Kehinde Wiley that we premiered just this morning at the Huntington, titled A Portrait of a Young Gentleman. And it was commissioned by the institution to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the acquisition of Blue Boy by Henry and Arabella Huntington in 1921. So with these two portraits in mind, just thinking about the panel we just had, portraiture and commodity and commodification really sort of seems to me to sort of be a thread through all three of the talks. And we can talk about commodities as things that are owned, purchased, and we see in the Kehinde Wiley painting, I think, a sense that he's also playing with ideas of commodification, especially with regard to fashion. I love the figures wearing a nice pair of Vans sneakers. And we see it in Thomas Gainsborough's Blue Boy with the costume of blue satin. Also remembering that Blue Boy as a painting shows us that portraiture was a commodity itself. It was made as an advertisement for Thomas Gainsborough to display his skills to potential clients at the Royal Academy. So I am going to stop sharing my screen now and invite our panelists, if anyone has any questions to ask, are across the conference, and then I'll turn it over to some Q&A from the audience.
I had a question, mostly, well, first of all, great talks, which raised a lot of questions for me, but I have one which I wanted to ask Amelia, and that's the question you asked but didn't answer. I was curious to hear what your thoughts are in terms of that process of cultural appropriation of slave or Creole fashion. Because if the slave is associated with a negative sensorium, debased and considered to be socially dead, or all those categories, what is the process that turns their fashions and their products into acceptable things in high society? So I'm just curious about that middle ground before we move. How does it move from the plantation and become something to be celebrated in high society in the European metropolis? How does it get disconnected, so to speak, from the culture that produced it and its violence and racism and so on? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, I must say my answers are largely inspired by, or to a great degree inspired by your work on slavery and the culture of taste, and the way in which this can, that these products underlie the taste. They're not external to it. I think there's some sense in which, first of all, madras was and the blued and bleached muslin was desirable simply because it was exotic and it was expensive, and it came, not expensive, but it was hard to get. I mean, madras was banned from sale from within mainland Europe. And so its scarcity at first made it desirable. But I think more so than that, there was a sort of sickly glamour associated with Creole culture that I'm trying to understand. So there are a lot of accounts, contemporary accounts of the lassitude and paleness of white women who grew up in the Caribbean, and that there's a sort of desirability attached to the way that those women are described as very, that it was a fashionable, I'm thinking here of the idea of fashionable diseases in the 18th century, that in a way this sort of the lassitude of Creole culture as it was discussed in Europe, this was kind of viewed as a fashionable disease. It was decadent. There's also the sense of well, maybe I'll stop there. I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought a little bit, so I'll stop.
Can I perhaps follow that up with a, I also have a question for Amelia, which it's more of a methodological question, I think. And perhaps because I'm not an art historian, there's a way in which I think some of the work that you're doing could be in dialogue with more directly with work in Black studies or in Afro-diasporic studies. And I'm wondering if, for example, rather than posing the question, is this figure human, to approach it through the material realities through which the fabric is produced, and which has been taken up kind of, I'm imagining, like what would Sylvia Wynter say about this? How does this sort of tradition of thinking through materiality and ontology specifically relate to perhaps a different type of methodological approach in art history, but I think it's one that we're tasking ourselves with trying to discuss today. So I kind of wonder, like, if how these two things might be put into dialogue.
Yeah, thank you for that.
While we were just asking Amelia, may I quickly add, Amelia, it's so nice to see you. I can't help, I'm sorry, like I have to be the obligatory South Asianist and bring South Asia back into this conversation, because muslin is not produced in the West Indies. It's too fine a cotton to be produced. I mean, if anything, it's a technology that gets completely eliminated by the forces of colonialism, as like many scholars have shown. And I was just really struck that there's such a sort of fascinating kind of conflation of the two Indies within this story as well. And as much as I appreciate your gesture towards like the French, like the spaces of the salon and like the West Indies, but I keep thinking of like Tilly Kettle's portraits of the Nawab of Arcot, and like those, the jama is exactly what those neoclassical dresses look like. Yeah. So it's to me, it seemed a little less like the Madras. I get what you're doing in terms of the materiality for the Madras connection, but in terms of form, they're very much still trying to look not just like South Asian elites, but South Asian male elites. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I agree with you. I think that the form of the dress is, I think it does owe something to the West Indian form of the round gown, but I understand the connection also to the jama, and I agree with you, and that's something I want to explore more. And I think it's fascinating too, the idea that there would be this aspiration to look like a man, and to layer that association on top of the others that I've identified. So I agree with you, and I think that that's something to add to for me to keep looking at.
So we do have a question from the audience. Hector Reyes asks, in both Amy's and Zirwat's talk, I'm struck by the foundational difference, parentheses, Black maternal body and dogs, figured in portraiture that guarantees both forms of abstraction, in this case, epistemological categories and conventions of portraiture, notions of familial and social relations, etc., and claims about physical forms in Enlightenment thought. I wonder if Amy and Zirwat could talk more about the pictorial surface as a site of different types of difference.
I can try to take that on. Hi, Hector. So when you're talking about the pictorial surface, I'm trying to piece together the parts of your question so that I can answer it in the best way possible. So you're thinking about the surface of for instance, in my case, oil paintings, materiality of the work of art, and connecting it to, say, theories of materiality and the Enlightenment. Tell me more so I can answer in the best way. So can Hector actually tell me more?
Well, he'll have to type some more.
Okay, sorry about that. Then maybe I should take a stab as written to think about, okay, so difference, difference in my case, difference of species, difference between dogs and humans, that guarantees kinds of abstraction, for instance, categories of human and animal and possible crossings between them, and claims about physical forms in Enlightenment thought. I mean, I can take on that piece by saying that the questions of human and animal in Enlightenment philosophy in France and in England, as Zirwat is showing us as well, are coming out of this kind of materialist philosophy about the importance of sensation in forming the self. And on that line of reasoning, of course, animals have a claim to personhood because the senses are their superpower. And one of the things that I probably should have talked more about in the talk, but given the time limits didn't, was the question of the bodily self versus the face. I kind of frame it in this Levinas framework of the face, but as you can tell, there's the question of the animal self is a question of the body. And that is there's only one head-only portrait of a dog that I have found, and it's a joke, right? It's a joke about how animal identity has to be the whole body. And in that there's a difference in understanding between the animal, an additional difference in the understanding between the human and the animal body. And I was trying to get at that too with my punning title of Dogsbodies, of what we consider a self. I don't know if that gets to the pictorial surface, but I'm going to turn it over to Zirwat if she wants to take it on.
Yeah, I think equally I can only gesture some possibilities. Thank you, Hector. I mean, I think what's been striking to me and kind of going down the rabbit hole of whether we call it Enlightenment materialism or just broadly like sensationalist philosophy, I've just been very struck by how formalist it is in its contours. And that's very much more so about likeness than difference. And it's, I think, what we have been trained to kind of see as like this relation to the world in terms of object relations and difference. What keeps coming up in these possibilities of that difference actually being not possible to demarcate. And so I think for me, like, especially like, I think what shifted my relationship to that Ord painting was to start seeing resemblances and similarities, and resemblances both, in terms of like kinship, right, which is so much of the thread of my argument, but resemblance as a kind of formal association of being in the world itself. So I would say, like, I think as art historians, we're trained so much to look for difference. And I think what's been fun is, and I think because so much of the convention of looking at similitude or similarity has been through like a kind of emblematic convention, that there's a slightly different texture to finding a different way of thinking about likeness and similarity. And then just quickly, I want to note that, as Amy, you were giving your talk, I was just so struck by when you mentioned like just the emphasis on the sensory organs of the dogs, because it really throws into relief that the landscape in which they're set are still such painterly landscapes. Like, I'm just thinking about all the scholarship that's coming out about like, when you take mushrooms, you see the world as the fungus would, right? And I'm just kind of like, what would a portrait like this, to run with your idea of the dog's bodies, how would it register that sensation as well? And I think that's where there's such a kind of fundamentally like Lockean, like appropriative humanity that's still part of the representational scheme for me.
Ooh, we should talk a lot later, maybe.
I think we're about time for our next break. Thank you so much, panelists. This was fantastic. Steve, when do we come back?
So I think we should really try and keep to the original time on the timetable, because I'm conscious that people may have obligations after 4:30 on the East Coast. So let's reconvene at 12:30. That's 22 minutes from now.